this video, we're going to talk about transitions and animations in CSS. So let's get started. As you can see here, I have a basic HTML page set up, and I just have an H1 in here and a link with just a hashtag in the href. And then in my CSS file, I have nothing there at the moment. So if we look in the browser, we can see here is our link, and it has some default styles to it. And of course, links have a number of states associated with them. For instance, the hover state or the active state, which is when you actually click on it. So I can create styles for any of those things. So if I go into my CSS and I just select for the links and I go ahead and I can do anything I want to. I can change the color purple. I can get rid of that underline, text decoration, none. Maybe I want to make this look a little bit more like a button. So I'm going to tell it to have a border, 2 pixels, solid, and we won't specify a color, which means it'll be the same color as the text, that purple. And I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of padding. I'll give 1 rem all the way around. Let's see what happens if we look at that in the browser. We can see we have a big old linky looking thing. And that padding isn't causing it to push away from the H1 because links are by default inline elements, which means that they don't respect vertical padding or margin or border when it comes to layout. So I'm actually just going to come in here and I'm going to do display and inline block, which will respect vertical padding, margin, and border. And I'm just going to fix my alphabetization here. Very good. We got a nice looking link here. You can see now we have that space on top because we changed it to inline block, so it's respecting that. But I want to do something with the hover state. When I hover my mouse over, I want to give some kind of visual indicator that it's going to respond to a click. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to select for the hover state, A colon hover. So that's for when you are hovering your mouse over it. We'll just do a couple of things. I'll change the color to white and I will give it a background color of purple so we can kind of reverse out the colors when I hover over it. So let's see that in action. Okay, you can see it works. But one of the things you'll notice here is that the change happens instantaneously as I move my mouse over. There's no animation at all between the two states. But with CSS, I can actually control that. So I have a property, it is called transition, which is going to transition the CSS from this state to this state. So the first thing I need to tell it is which properties I want to transition. The things I've changed are background color and color. So I could select one of them if I wanted to. So we could say we just want to transition that background color. And then we need to tell it how long we want it to take to transition. So I'm going to go ahead and do 1.5 seconds. And this is actually going to be fairly slow, but let's take a look. Okay, here you can see it does indeed take 1.5 seconds for that background to change to purple, but the text changes to white right away. Having the text turn white right away kind of gives us like almost a flash of white here. I don't really want that. So instead of telling it to just transition the background color, I'm going to tell it to transition all. And all means it's going to transition everything that can be transitioned, every property that can be transitioned. Some properties can't be transitioned. For instance, text decoration, it's either there or it's not. There's no in between, so you can't transition that. But anything that has a numeric value and colors behind the scenes are basically numeric values can be transitioned. So let's see what happens now that we've used all instead of just targeting the background color. Now everything sort of fades slowly. Notice something else though. Right now, it's only transitioning when I move my mouse in. When I move my mouse back out, it's going back to the default state instantaneously. The reason for this is that transitions exist on endpoints. So we've put the transition on the hover, therefore the transition only happens as it moves to the hover. If I want it to transition in both directions, I have to also put a transition on the default state. So now it'll transition to the hover and it'll transition back. Transition to the hover and it'll transition back. Now, another thing to pay attention to is that this is quite slow. Transitions, usually for interactivity, should generally be below a second. I tend to start with about half a second because users don't want to feel like things are taking place leisurely. They want to feel like the app or website that they're interacting with is very responsive and snappy. So let's see how about half a second. Yeah, pretty good. I might actually lengthen that just a little bit. Of course, every animation is different, so you really have to trust your eye on these. So I'm going to try 3/4 of a second. That feels about right to me. Now, we've shown how with transition, you can first do a transition property. So you can do any one property or you can do all. We've shown how you can do transition duration. So how long the transition lasts. There's actually a third property we can put on this transition shorthand, and that is what's called the timing function. People from the world of animation will be familiar with this, but most of the rest of us haven't heard this. Basically, when it is moving from the one state to the other, without any third value here, it's moving at the same speed all the way across the change. I'm actually going to turn the speed back up. I'll make each of these 1.75 seconds. And I will take these back off. And let's just see how it looks. To and from. And it's just moving at a constant speed as that animation executes. I'm going to add one of these keywords to this timing function. I'm going to add ease. Basically, that what that means is start out changing slow, speed up, then slow down at the end. So let's see how that looks. And this is only going to have the ease as we move to the hover state. And there's what it looks like when it is linear when we go back. So ease, linear. The difference is pretty subtle. There are also a couple variations of this. You can do ease in, which means start out slow and end fast. Let's see if we can see that. Slow, then fast. Slow, then fast. We can also do ease out, which is the opposite. That means start fast and slow. Fast, slow. So it's almost like a fade out. So these are timing functions. There are also custom timing functions you can do. I won't get too much into that here, but timing functions can add a lot of naturalism to your animation because not many things in the real world move at a constant rate or transform at a constant rate. Most things in the real world have to speed up or slow down as they're moving from place to place. So these are CSS transitions. We can use the property value to tell it which properties we want to transition, or we can use all to transition every property that can be transitioned. We can use duration to tell it how long we want the transition to last. And then we can add a timing function. We can use keywords like ease in, ease out, or a custom timing function, which we haven't explored here, to add a little bit of naturalism to that transition. But the thing about transitions is it's only point to point. We can only have a start and an end, and we can't put anything fun in the middle. To change that, we can do something else entirely. So I'm going to take these transitions off of here, and we're going to explore what's called keyframe animation. Keyframe animation means that we can set as many middle points as we want to in an animation as it moves through. And this works a very different way from keyframe animations. We're going to first define the animation itself with this at keyframes, ampersand keyframes, and then a space, and we can name the animation whatever we want to. I'll call this color fade. Okay, then we do some curly brackets. And inside of here, we're going to write out all the steps in our animation. So the animation is going to start at 0% through the time that it takes to go through the animation. In other words, the beginning. So we can just set our background color here, and we don't have a background color here, so we'll just match that. We'll say transparent. And then we can set other percentages. So let's go ahead and set 100%, which is the end of the animation. And we can say background color purple. And so right now what I have isn't really going to be any different from the transition we had before. It's just going to move straight from transparent to purple. But here's what we couldn't do with transition is add middle values. So I can say at 50% have a background color, let's say orange. And also, as we're moving through, we can put more than one property to change. So remember, we were changing our color as well in our previous transition. So I'm going to start on purple, and I'm going to end on white, which is what we did before. And I'm not going to put anything at this 50% mark because if I don't put anything special in there, it'll just move right across that. So straight from purple to white, even through that 50% mark. So now we've defined our animation, we've named it, we've set up the points on it. Now I need to make it happen. So there is a property called animation name. And that's where we're just going to plug in the name that we gave our animation. It's a name we came up with. So color fade. That's what we named our animation. So that's what I'm going to do here. We need one other thing to make the animation work, and that is animation duration. How long is this animation going to last? Let's make it fairly long so we can really see what's going on. Let's do 2 seconds. I'm actually going to move these properties onto the hover state so that we can trigger them when we hover, just like we were doing before. Otherwise, it would trigger just as soon as the page loads. So I'm going to go ahead, and when I hover, watch this animation. It steps through those various colors. We can add more points in here. I'm going to make the animation even longer so we can really see this happen. I can add another step in here. What if I added 25% and we said background color blue, and then at 75%, I added background color pink. And now we go into the browser. It's going to cycle through all these colors. And this is maybe not a very pretty animation, not what you might want to use, but you can see how it works, how it goes across the amount of time that we gave, and it steps through these various percentages. 100% always matches however many seconds we give. So if I say 4 seconds, now it's going to be 1 second is 25%, 2 seconds is 50%, 3 seconds is 75%, 4 seconds is 100%. So it's just going to map these percentages across the amount of time I gave. We can see that going through. And with animation, just like with transition, we can do a timing function. So animation timing function, and I can do ease, any of those same keywords. So now let's see how it starts speeding up and slows down at the end. We can do the same things. We can do ease out, and we can go fast and then slow down. So very similar. There's a few other things that we can do that are pretty cool. One is animation delay. So we can actually set an animation delay, which will make the animation not trigger right away. And we can delay it. Let's try 1 second. We just put how much we want it to wait, and then we hover, it waits, and then it goes through our animation. Let me show you how we could write this same thing as shorthand. So if I take all of these out, we can use the animation shorthand property. So first we'll do our name, color, fade. Then we can do how long we want it to last, 4 seconds. We'll tell it to ease, that's our timing function. And then we can tell it our delay, 1 second. And what's great about this is we can actually do multiple animations and stack them. So what if I wanted to make a new animation? So at keyframes, and I will name this one, how's about rotate? And then we go ahead and set everything up. So I will do 0%, and I'll do transform. So transform is a property that allows us to do a number of interesting things. I'm going to do rotate, and in here, I'm going to put 0. I don't want it to be rotated at 0%. Then I'm going to do 50%. And at 50%, I'm going to do transform, rotate, and we need to tell it in degrees. So let's do 90 deg. I don't know why you'd want to do this, but it's just for demonstration purposes, so it doesn't have to make sense. And then at 100%, we'll put it back to where it started. So transform, rotate, 0. Okay, so now we've set up this animation, but we can actually add it to this one. So let's actually turn off our delay on this one. So our first animation won't be delayed. Now we can do rotate, which is the name of that animation we just created. We can tell it how long we want to take, so 2 seconds. And then let's tell it to delay 4 seconds, which is the length of this first animation. So the second animation won't start until the first one is done. And we'll throw some easing on here too. Let's see what happens. I hover, it goes through the color fade animation, and then when it's done, it rotates and rotates back. So we've stacked those animations for a more interesting effect. And we can use as many properties as we want. Another property that is often useful for these things, if you want something to fade in or fade out of the page, is you can use opacity. So I can do opacity 0, that means it's invisible, and I can do opacity 1, which means it's totally visible, which means now when we hover, we'll get a fade in effect. Of course, that doesn't make much sense over a link, but you can imagine if we were using an animation for opening a modal or opening an accordion or something, that opacity might be a good thing to use for that content that's coming onto the page. So now let's see that in action. Invisible and fades in. And then, of course, we still have our little rotation that's going to play too. So you can do some really interesting and powerful things by creating keyframe animations and then stacking them and using the delay function to get them to trigger in series or in relation to each other. And because we have created named keyframe animations, we can reuse this color fade in various places throughout our CSS. And we can reuse this rotate in various places throughout our CSS and use this one animation in a lot of different places and in a lot of different contexts. I just briefly want to see what happens if we put this all on the regular A and not on the hover. So let's take it from there and let's put it on here. Notice that when we reload the page, it starts firing that animation right away. So basically, the way CSS works is it honors a property as soon as that selector is recognized. So if you put it right on an element, it's going to trigger as soon as that element loads onto the page. So we could take advantage of this for a sort of fading in effect. So if we would just did one more quick at keyframes and we'll call it fade in, and then we'll just do 0% opacity 0 and 100% opacity 1. That's full opacity. And then we come up onto here, and instead of using these other keyframes we set up, why don't we just use that fade in? And I'll try ease out for an interesting look. Now, we're going to get this fade in as the page loads. So you can kind of get an interesting page loading effect. Let's see what happens when we refresh. That's maybe too fast. I'm going to slow it back down. 4 seconds, and we'll refresh the page, and we'll get a fade in effect. We could also combine that with some of those transforms. We can also use transform to move things. So I could do transform and we'll do translate X, which means move on the X axis. -4 rem. Then we will go to 0 rem, which is its starting place where the element would naturally sit. So this is 4 rem to the left of where it would naturally sit. Let's try again. Let's load the page. So now we get this sort of loading slide in, and that's maybe a little too slow. You can play with these, and there's a lot of art to getting it to look good. But these are some examples of things you can do with CSS animations, keyframe animations, is you can do fade in effects, you can do hover effect, you can do things when new dialogues open or accordions open. So there's a lot of things you can do with it. That is just a brief crash course, quick look at transition and CSS keyframe animation. We can use the transition property to set which properties will transition. We can use duration to tell it how long to take. We can use a timing function to tell it whether that should happen linearly or have a little bit of speed change across the course of it for more naturalism. If a transition isn't enough for us, we can use keyframe animations where we use at keyframes and name the animation. And then we can set out our different CSS properties across the individual keyframes by percent. Then once we have that all set up, we can plug in our animation name using either the animation name property or the animation shorthand. We can tell it an animation duration, how long we want the animation to take. We can give it an animation timing function. So just like with transition, we can tell it whether we want it to move at the same speed or whether we want it to speed up or slow down. And we can use animation delay to make it so that an animation doesn't trigger right away, which is useful when you're combining multiple animations to get a more complex effect. So there you go. That's CSS transitions and animations.